You know, when you think about the Great Depression, the story that usually comes to mind is boom, sudden collapse. A classic tale of a wild party followed by a massive hangover, right? A necessary correction. But what if that's not the whole story? Okay, let's dig into this. So in this explainer, we're going to dig into some pretty compelling evidence. Stuff that suggests that way before the big crash in October 1929, America's biggest banks were, well, they were already broke. Technically insolvent anyway. That means, on paper, their debts were already way bigger than their assets, even if they hadn't actually collapsed yet. And that leads us to a really provocative question, one that's at the heart of the material we're looking at today. What if the biggest economic collapse in modern history wasn't actually a failure? What if it was a desperate, and in the end successful, move by the insiders to save themselves? Site source, 0056. All right, to even begin to wrap our heads around that idea, we've got to look past all the glitter and glamour of the Roaring '20s. Because according to this analysis, the good times everyone talks about, they were built on a foundation that was just incredibly shaky, dangerously unbalanced. Just look at this. This slide really lays bare the massive gap at the heart of the system. Between 1921 and 1929, American banks went on a lending spree, expanding their loan books by a whopping 63%. But, and this is the crazy part, their actual reserves, the real money they needed to back up all those loans, grew by just 10%. Site source, 0110. I mean, you don't have to be a math genius to see where this is going. It was a ticking time bomb. And the thing is, the source we're looking at argues that pretty much every top banking exec knew it. They knew how fragile it all was, even if they never admitted in public. They knew the entire financial structure was this magnificent, beautiful building built on a foundation of sand. So how did things get so bad? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm of interlocking problems. Let's just quickly run through the four big ones holding up this house of cards. First, you've got this extreme margin lending, which we'll get into in a sec. Then there was this wild real estate speculation, especially down in Florida, that left banks holding tons of worthless land. On top of that, you had a crisis in farming, with farmers totally crushed by debt. And finally, the whole thing was handcuffed by the gold standard, which meant the Fed couldn't just print money to stop the bleeding. Any one of these would be a huge problem. All of them together, it pretty much guaranteed a total meltdown. Okay, but the one everyone remembers, of course, was the margin lending. It was out of control. By 1929, an incredible $8.5 billion had been loaned out just so people could gamble on stocks. And the terms? Totally reckless. You could borrow up to 90% of a stock's value. This made people feel like geniuses when prices were going up, but it guaranteed absolute ruin the second they started to fall. And check this out, because this shows how the banks weren't just on the sidelines. They were playing the game themselves. Big players like National City Bank and Chase set up their own investment funds to trade in their own stock. Then they'd lend money to their customers, who would turn right around and use that borrowed money to buy the bank's stock. It was a perfect circle of debt, a feedback loop that only worked as long as prices went up, up, up. Okay, so if the whole system was already broken, then the crash wasn't the cause of the problem. According to this analysis, it was the solution. The argument is that the collapse wasn't a surprise to the insiders at all. It was a managed event, a controlled demolition. This timeline from 1929 really paints a picture that looks less like a random panic and more like a plan. In the summer, you've got insiders like Charles Mitchell quietly dumping their personal stock while telling the public everything's great. Then, by September, the interest rates on those margin loans shoot up to a crazy 20%, a huge red flag. When a statistician named Roger Babson actually warned a crash was coming, he was basically shouted down as a party pooper. And finally, on Black Thursday, the source suggests that the major banks all started selling hard right at the opening bell. You know that famous story about JP Morgan and the other bankers heroically stepping in to support the market? Well, this analysis presents that as pure theater. The argument is that it was just an illusion of responsible leadership, a way to prop up the market just long enough for them to unload the rest of their garbage stock onto a hopeful public before the whole thing came crashing down for good. So here's the key takeaway. The panic wasn't the problem. It was the solution. The crash was the perfect alibi. Every bad loan, all that margin debt, all that worthless real estate could now be blamed on one single catastrophic market event. It completely obscured the decade of reckless, fraudulent lending that actually caused the mess. And in the aftermath, wow, the numbers are just mind-boggling. Between 1930 and 1933, 9,000 banks in the US failed. But here's the thing. The most important question isn't how many failed, it's which ones. And this is the punchline right here. Those 9,000 banks that went under, they were overwhelmingly the little guys, small, regional, and rural community banks. Meanwhile, the huge money center banks that caused the bubble in the first place, places like Chase National Bank, they didn't just survive, they thrived. They nearly doubled in size by snapping up their dead competitors for pennies on the dollar. But even after gobbling up their competition, the big banks still had a huge problem. They were still technically broke from all those bad loans from the 20s. The final part of their rescue mission didn't come from the market, it came from the government, in what has to be one of the most unbelievable moves in American financial history. In 1933, Executive Order 6102 basically confiscated the public's gold. Citizens were forced to sell their gold to the Federal Reserve at a fixed price, and if you didn't, you could go to prison. Then the government immediately turned around and revalued that gold 69% higher, using the paper profit to bail out the banking system and make all those private losses disappear. So according to this analysis, the real legacy of the Great Depression wasn't just the economic pain. It was the creation of a playbook, a repeatable template for how to manage a financial crisis and consolidate power. And this 6-step pattern is shockingly simple when you lay it out. Step 1, create a fragile system through massive debt. Step 2, when the crisis inevitably hits, roll out emergency measures. Step 3, bail out your big connected friends. Step 4, let the smaller competition fail so you can buy them up cheap. Step 5, blame the whole thing on something external, never the bank's behavior. And finally, step 6, introduce reforms that actually lock in your newly consolidated power, source 1555. Once you see this template, the source argues, you start seeing it everywhere. The global financial crisis in 2008, the COVID response in 2020, and even the regional bank failures in 2023. It's the same themes over and over, selective bailouts and massive consolidation. I mean, let's just look at some recent examples. In 2008, Bear Stearns gets absorbed by JP Morgan. Merrill Lynch goes to Bank of America, source 1623. Fast forward to 2023, and what happens? The pattern repeats. JP Morgan picks up the pieces of the failed First Republic Bank, source 1821. It's a clear pattern of consolidation, not correction. So, to wrap up the main argument from our source here, these crises are not just random accidents. They're framed as these moments of creative destruction that let the biggest, most powerful players wipe their slates clean, get rid of their competition, and come out the other side even more dominant than before. And that leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling thought. The source material isn't really asking if another crisis is coming. It kind of suggests the vulnerabilities in the system make that a given. The real question it asks is this: what emergency will be used to justify the next great restructuring? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.